Jason, a police officer with 15 years of experience, sat in his living room, looking at old photographs. One of them was of his first wife, Lisa, who had tragically passed away in a car crash a few years earlier. Despite the time that had passed, Jason still felt the deep ache of her loss, yet he understood he had to continue with his life. Recently, Jason had remarried a younger woman, Sarah, who had a 20-year-old daughter, Emily, from her previous marriage. Emily was a bright, attractive young woman who had just returned home after finishing college. As they spent more time together, Jason and Emily grew close, and Jason began to see her as a replacement for the companionship he had once shared with Lisa. Sarah, who was 10 years younger than Jason, was glad to see her husband bonding well with her daughter. She believed their new family could become a strong, loving unit and had high hopes for the future. Sarah thought that Jason, with his calm demeanor and experience, would bring stability to their lives. However, Jason struggled with an emptiness within himself that he couldn't quite explain, and he wasn't sure how to fill it. In the quiet of the evenings, after Sarah and Emily had gone to bed, Jason would linger in the living room, staring at pictures of Lisa. He often felt like he had betrayed her memory by remarrying, but he knew he couldn't live in the past. He hoped that Sarah and Emily would help him move beyond the grief that still haunted him. But the guilt remained. Initially, Jason's marriage to Sarah seemed like a step toward healing. She was supportive and understanding, and he appreciated her warmth. But as time went on, he struggled with the lingering feelings tied to his first wife's death. The more time he spent with Emily, the more he saw qualities in her that reminded him of Lisa. Her intelligence, her kindness, even her appearance. It made him reflect on the life he had lost. Unlike Sarah, who was focused on building their family, Jason became more absorbed in the connection he was developing with Emily. He tried to push these thoughts away, knowing it was wrong to see Emily in such a way, but the feelings were undeniable. She was no longer just Sarah's daughter. She'd come to mean something much more to him, representing a chance to relive something he believed he had lost forever. This deeply unsettled him, but he never shared his thoughts with anyone. Sarah remained unaware of the growing tension inside her husband. She was focused on her own life, work, managing the household, and rebuilding her relationship with Emily, which had been strained during Emily's college years. She was grateful that Jason was there to offer support, especially since Emily seemed to look up to him more than any father figure before. Sarah believed their family, despite its complexities, was headed in the right direction. Meanwhile, Emily enjoyed the attention she received from Jason. She admired his strength and dedication to his community, as well as the way he had devoted himself to his work for so many years. His presence gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. Initially unsure about having Jason in her life, Emily soon came to appreciate him. Their conversations were easy, and Emily found herself opening up to Jason in ways she hadn't with her mother. For Jason, these moments brought both joy and inner conflict. He knew the risks of getting too close to Emily, but he couldn't help himself. Months had passed since Jason married Sarah, and although it was a new beginning, Jason still felt the emptiness inside that lingered from Lisa's death. He couldn't shake the feeling of loss, but he began to find comfort in Emily's company. Over time, their bond deepened, and Jason no longer saw her as just Sarah's daughter. He started to recognize Emily as a beautiful and intelligent young woman in her own right. Initially, Emily had been cautious around Jason. The idea of having a stepfather was unfamiliar, and Jason's presence was an adjustment. However, as they spent more time together, her reservations faded. She began to understand Jason's grief over Lisa and wanted to help him move past the pain. Gradually, their relationship shifted from familial to something more complex. They began to spend more time together intentionally, whether driving to run errands or staying up late watching movies after Sarah had gone to bed. The opportunities to be alone with Emily increased. What began as innocent companionship slowly evolved into something much more dangerous. Jason became drawn to Emily in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just filling the emotional gap left by Lisa. She had become the object of his desire. Emily, for her part, was flattered by Jason's attention. She admired his strength and maturity, qualities none of her peers possessed. His quiet grief over Lisa's death made him seem vulnerable, and Emily felt compelled to be there for him. What started as sympathy eventually turned into attraction. Emily began to look forward to their time together, appreciating Jason's resilience, experience, and even his protective nature. His presence made her feel safe. Jason knew his growing relationship with Emily was forbidden, yet he couldn't stop himself. She was young, full of life, and everything he felt was missing from his marriage to Sarah. Emily represented a second chance at the passion he had lost with Lisa. She brought an energy and youth into his life that he hadn't felt in years. Emily, who was 20 years younger than Jason, started to see him as more than just her stepfather. She began viewing him as a man, not just a family member. She didn't think about the inappropriateness of their growing bond. She only knew that Jason made her feel special in a way no one else had. He listened to her, respected her opinions, and treated her as an equal. For Emily, who had spent years away from home and had only recently returned from college, Jason offered a sense of stability and excitement she found hard to resist. Jason knew it was wrong, and he was painfully aware of the consequences if anyone, especially Sarah, discovered his feelings for Emily. But the thrill of their secret meetings was too much to ignore. Jason had never felt so alive, even though that vitality came with a constant undercurrent of guilt. He couldn't help but justify his actions, convincing himself that what they shared was unique, something that transcended the normal rules. In his mind, their connection was special, different from any other relationship he had ever experienced. Emily, equally swept up in the intensity of their affair, began to ignore the warning signs. She knew that if Sarah found out, it would destroy their family, but the allure of being with Jason was too powerful. Emily felt a sense of empowerment in their secret relationship, one that defied the conventional rules she had known. Believing she was helping Jason move past his grief while also fulfilling her own need for connection and intimacy, Sarah and Jason navigated the delicate task of keeping their secret hidden from Sarah, all while allowing their growing passion to flourish. But deep down, Jason knew this couldn't last forever. Every secret meeting and every moment of closeness brought them closer to an inevitable confrontation, yet neither seemed willing to stop. Sarah had always trusted Jason. After all, he was her husband and a dedicated police officer, a man with strong principles. But recently, something had shifted. She began to notice that Jason and Emily were spending more time together. Initially, Sarah dismissed it, assuming it was just Jason trying to be a supportive stepfather since Emily had just returned from college and they were simply bonding. At first, she tried to ignore it, telling herself she was overthinking things and that her suspicions were unfounded. After all, she had no solid reason to doubt them. But as time went on, her unease turned into suspicion. She started noticing patterns. Jason and Emily found excuses to be alone, whether under the guise of errands, household chores, or late-night conversations after Sarah had gone to bed. What once seemed like a harmless bond between stepfather and stepdaughter now felt inappropriate, even strange. The distance between Sarah and Jason also began to widen. He seemed distracted, often avoiding eye contact during their conversations. There was a coldness now that hadn't been there before. Sarah tried to discuss her concerns with him, but he brushed her off, claiming he was just tired from work or suggesting that she was imagining things. The more he dismissed her feelings, the more convinced Sarah became that something deeper was at play. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah lay awake in bed, replaying the events of the past few months. She remembered how Jason had once been so attentive to her needs, but now it seemed like his attention had completely shifted to Emily. When had the change begun? Sarah couldn't pinpoint an exact moment, but the difference in their marriage was undeniable. Unable to shake her suspicions, Sarah began to observe them more closely. She paid attention to how Jason acted around Emily. He seemed more relaxed and at ease with her than he did with Sarah. It wasn't just the casual conversations or the way they laughed at each other's jokes. It was the intensity of their connection, the way they seemed to orbit around each other in the room. Sarah's unease grew into a sense of dread. One afternoon, when Jason was at work and Emily was out with friends, Sarah decided to look through Jason's phone. She had never done anything like that before. Privacy was something she had always respected, but her anxiety pushed her to do it. Her hands shook as she scrolled through his messages. At first, there was nothing suspicious, just work-related conversations and casual exchanges with friends. Then she found a series of texts between Jason and Emily. While the messages weren't explicit, they conveyed a subtle intimacy, inside jokes, vague mentions of secret plans, and an underlying affection far beyond what she considered appropriate between a stepfather and stepdaughter. One message from Emily read, "Last night was fun, can't wait to see you again later." Sarah's stomach dropped. She didn't need more details. Her worst fears were being confirmed. In shock, she sat down, trying to process what she had just discovered. The betrayal was overwhelming. She had trusted both Jason and Emily, and now it felt like her world was falling apart. How could this have happened? What had she missed? Sarah thought back to all the moments she had ignored, every time she had dismissed her instincts. She felt foolish for not acting sooner, but now it was undeniable. Jason and Emily were having an affair. Meanwhile, Jason began to sense that Sarah was growing suspicious. He noticed her watching him more closely, her questions becoming sharper. He tried to be careful, avoiding situations where he and Emily might be alone when Sarah was around. But the tension was mounting, and Jason knew it was only a matter of time before Sarah confronted him. Despite this, he couldn't bring himself to end his affair with Emily. He was too emotionally and physically invested, and the thought of losing what he had with her was unbearable. Emily, for her part, remained unaware of the rising tension in the household. She continued her secret meetings with Jason, oblivious to Sarah's growing suspicion. Emily believed that what they shared was a secret that no one else could understand. She had no idea that Sarah had already started piecing things together. The atmosphere in the house became increasingly heavy. Sarah found it harder to maintain a normal facade. Every time she looked at Jason, she saw a stranger. Every time she looked at Emily, her heart broke a little more. The betrayal from both of them was suffocating, and Sarah wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. Finally, one evening, Sarah decided she couldn't wait any longer. The weight of the secret was too much, and she knew that the longer she allowed it to fester, the worse things would become. She had to confront Jason, no matter how painful it would be. The conversation, however, didn't go as Sarah had hoped. Gathering her courage, she asked both Jason and Emily to sit down in the living room. Her heart raced as she prepared to say the words that had been weighing on her for weeks. She looked at them, Jason, her husband, and Emily, her daughter, and felt a sharp pang of betrayal. This confrontation was necessary, but it was also the moment she had dreaded most. "Something's been going on between you two," Sarah began, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I know what you've been doing. I've seen the way you look at each other. This can't continue." Jason and Emily exchanged nervous glances but quickly regained their composure. Jason was the first to speak. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. There's nothing going on between us. You're letting your imagination run wild." Emily, sitting quietly next to Jason, nodded in agreement. "Mom, you're wrong. Jason's just been helping me adjust after college. We've been spending more time together because we're family now." Sarah's pulse quickened. Their denial, despite all the evidence she had seen, only fueled her frustration. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice breaking. "I've seen the texts. I've seen the way you touch each other, the way you sneak around. You're both lying to my face, and I won't tolerate it anymore." Instead of admitting to their actions, Jason and Emily continued to gaslight her. They insisted that Sarah was paranoid, that she was overreacting, that she was imagining things. Jason tried to calm her, insisting that she was mistaken, but his words only intensified Sarah's anger. "This is not paranoia," she snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "You've been betraying me, both of you. How could you do this?" Emily sat frozen, guilt evident in her eyes, but she remained silent. Jason, however, stood up, his tone now defensive. "Sarah, you're out of line. Emily is my stepdaughter, and you need to stop with these accusations. You're tearing us apart." At that moment, Sarah realized that there was no turning back. They would never admit the truth, at least not to her. They had chosen each other over her, and she couldn't continue living in this house, in this lie. "I'm done," Sarah whispered, her voice full of resignation. "I can't live like this. I'm leaving." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jason's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected her to walk away. "What do you mean, leaving?" he asked, his voice suddenly unsure. "Where are you going?" "Anywhere but here," Sarah replied, standing up and walking toward the door. "I'm not staying in this house where I'm treated like I'm crazy. I deserve better than this. I want a divorce," she said, turning to face Jason one last time before walking out. "You and Emily can have each other, but I'm done being part of this." With that, Sarah left the house, leaving Jason and Emily in stunned silence. For the first time since the affair began, the reality of their actions began to sink in for both Jason and Emily. They hadn't expected Sarah to actually leave. They had justified their actions, believing they could continue their relationship in secret with no real consequences. But now, Sarah's departure shattered that illusion. Jason felt an unfamiliar sense of panic rise within him. He hadn't expected things to unravel so quickly. "I'll talk to her," he muttered more to himself than to Emily. "She's just upset. She'll come around." But as Jason tried to calm himself, Emily sat quietly, her face pale and expressionless. For the first time, she fully grasped the weight of what they had done. This wasn't a harmless flirtation or a temporary lapse in judgment. They had destroyed Sarah's trust and torn their family apart. Now the consequences were staring them in the face. "I didn't think it would come to this," Emily whispered, more to herself than to Jason. "I didn't think she'd leave." Jason remained silent, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to fix the situation. But deep down, he knew there was no easy solution. Sarah was gone, and there was nothing he could say or do to undo the damage that had been done. Over the next few days, Jason tried reaching out to Sarah, calling her and leaving messages, but she didn't respond. She had moved in with a friend and was in the process of filing for divorce. She refused to engage with him, knowing that any conversation would only bring more pain. She was done with him. Done with the lies, and done with the life they had built together. Jason arrived at the apartment complex, feeling a mix of anger, fear, and a need to regain control. When Sarah opened the door, her expression was cold and resolute. She wasn't going to change her mind. Jason could see it in her eyes before she even spoke. "I'm not coming back, Jason," she said flatly, her voice devoid of the warmth it once held. "It's over." Jason stepped inside, ignoring her attempt to close the door. "We need to talk about this, Sarah. You can't just throw away everything we've built." "There's nothing left to talk about," Sarah replied, turning away from him as she walked deeper into the small apartment. "I've already made up my mind. You need to accept it." Sarah, however, remained unmoved. "You and Emily have already destroyed this family," she said firmly. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I don't want anything more to do with you." Her words felt like a slap to the face. Jason felt something snap inside him. His desperation transformed into blind, overwhelming rage. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his vision blurring with the intensity of his emotions. "You can't leave me," Jason muttered, his voice low and trembling. "You can't just walk away like this." But Sarah didn't respond. She had already turned her back on him and was moving toward the bedroom, signaling that the conversation was over. Jason followed her, fists clenched at his sides, his breathing erratic. His mind was spiraling, an uncontrollable mix of anger and fear. He felt as though he was losing control of the situation, of Sarah, of everything. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Jason grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her back toward him. She gasped in surprise, but there was no time for her to react. Jason's hands were around her throat. Before she could scream, time seemed to stretch and collapse all at once. Sarah's struggles grew weaker, her gasps for air growing quieter, until finally her body went limp in his hands. Only then did Jason snap back to reality, realizing what he had done. He released his grip, and Sarah's lifeless body crumpled to the floor. The silence in the room was deafening. The realization hit him like a wave of ice-cold water. Sarah was dead. Jason stumbled backward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had killed her. He had killed his wife. In the next room, Emily had heard the commotion. The sounds of the struggle had caught her attention, and when the noise stopped, a sickening sense of dread filled her. She rushed to the bedroom, her heart pounding in her chest. When she entered, the sight before her was like something out of a nightmare. Jason stood there, pale and trembling, while Sarah lay motionless on the floor. "Mom!" Emily screamed, rushing to Sarah's side. She dropped to her knees, shaking her mother's lifeless body, but there was no response. Sarah was gone. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she turned to Jason, her expression a mix of horror and disbelief. "What did you do?" she cried, her voice breaking with anguish. "What have you done?" Jason could barely speak. He stood frozen, his mind reeling from the gravity of what had just occurred. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. There was no way to fix this. "I didn't mean to," Jason stammered, his voice barely audible. "It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt her, but it was too late for excuses. The damage was done." Sarah was dead, and the life Jason once knew had been shattered beyond repair. Emily, still shaken by the events, dialed 911. Her hands trembled as she explained to the dispatcher what had happened. The shock of witnessing her mother's death and the horrifying truth of Jason's actions weighed heavily on her as she waited for the authorities to arrive. Within minutes, the police were on the scene, and Jason was arrested without resistance. As he was led out of the house in handcuffs, Jason barely spoke. His once composed demeanor was shattered, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had just thrown away everything. Emily could only watch in numb silence, unable to comprehend how her life had taken such a devastating turn. The police immediately launched an investigation. Detectives combed through the evidence, piecing together the sequence of events that led to Sarah's death. They found Sarah's phone with messages hinting at her growing suspicion of Jason and Emily's relationship. Further investigation revealed months of secret meetings, long conversations, and a deepening connection between Jason and Emily that ultimately set this tragic course in motion. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. News of the case had spread quickly, and the media had seized on the shocking details of the crime. The fact that Jason, a respected police officer, had not only committed murder, but had also been involved in a secret relationship with his stepdaughter, sent waves of outrage through the community. Jason sat in the defendant's seat, his once authoritative posture now slouched and broken. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution presented a compelling case, outlining the events that led to the murder and emphasizing Jason's motives. The prosecutor argued that Jason had killed Sarah in a fit of rage, unable to handle the impending divorce and the threat of losing both his wife and his illicit relationship with Emily. Emily was called as a witness, and her testimony was one of the most painful moments of the trial. As she took the stand, the weight of her role in the tragedy became all too real. She recounted the events of that night in a voice that wavered with emotion. She described how she had heard her mother's screams and rushed into the room, only to find Jason standing over Sarah's lifeless body. The defense attempted to argue that Jason had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, that the stress of his personal life had driven him to an uncontrollable outburst. They pointed to his years of service as a police officer, emphasizing his dedication to the law and his community. But the jury remained unconvinced. The prosecution's case was too strong, and the evidence too damning. After weeks of testimony and emotional appeals, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Jason was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his final remarks, condemned Jason's actions as a tragic abuse of trust and power, stating that his crime had left an indelible scar on the lives of all involved.